Hello and welcome to this India Today special, where we are joined by a very special guest. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, joins us. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Swaminathan, in this tough time. I want to ask you, from your vantage position in Geneva at the WHO headquarters, how do you see COVID 2.0, this second wave in India? More than 4 lakh cases being added per day, more than 4,000 deaths officially per day. How do you see the bigger picture?
Thank you, Rajdeep, for inviting me on your show. And we are obviously very, very concerned about the situation in India, as we are in several other countries, including in the neighborhood of India, where we are seeing cases rising quite significantly, and in other parts of the world. I think we're at a very, very fragile and difficult state in this pandemic, where many countries have loosened the public health measures and restrictions that had been put in place in 2020. People have got back to normal lives, believing that vaccinations were there and that would solve the problem. And then we've had the new variants in many parts of the world, which is the virus basically evolving itself to be more transmissible and be more effective. So we are at a critical juncture, and we need to be very vigilant at this point in time, and also very proactive in what we're doing to contain the situation.
I'll come to the proactive elements in a moment, but were you and others, and indeed perhaps in India and across the world, taken by surprise by the intensity of this second wave? Did it catch everyone by surprise, off guard, and as a result, some were ill prepared?
I think looking at the behavior of this virus and the epidemiology over the last 17 months or so, we have seen this pattern happening in many countries, where the virus initially is transmitting within the community at relatively low levels. And you know the behavior of this virus, because each person infects, one other person on average. And in a large country with a large population, this can be invisible for quite some time. It's happening, but unless you're looking very closely at your surveillance data, you wouldn't see that it's gradually increasing. And then we know that it reaches this inflection point where the growth becomes exponential, which is when the cases are already in thousands and then they're multiplying by thousands every day. That's the difficulty, because it gets picked up and noticed by people only when it reaches a point where it's already taken off. And at that point, it's in such an accelerated increase that it's really very difficult to stop that without some very tough, measures, stringent measures. So the point really is that one needs to be looking at the data very closely all along. I mean, there are always hints. You can see weeks before the test positivity rates going up, the number of cases going up, hospital admissions gradually increasing. But at that time, it doesn't look like it's very serious. But by the time it gets serious, it's too late.
The reason I'm asking you this is because there's a sense that India and the world, particularly India, let its guard down in early 2021, almost believing that they had conquered the virus. Those were the kind of public statements even coming in from ministers in the government of India. And there's a sense that led us to becoming ill-prepared. Do you agree that we let our guard down, that there was a feeling that the pandemic had been conquered, and even WHO perhaps could have sent sterner warnings possibly to India and the world at that time, that don't let your guard down?
In fact, that's exactly what the WHO has done. So if you look back at our statements and our briefings and our advisories that were going out from early in this year, when we saw what had happened in Europe after the holiday season, when social mixing had resulted in these huge increases in countries which had really brought down transmission fairly effectively over last year. In January, in February, we were telling countries, do not let your guard down. And for the last 10 weeks, we've seen globally an increase in cases and an increase in deaths. And every week we've been saying, this is not the situation we need to be in. Every country really needs to start acting. So I think we knew that this could happen again. When exactly it happens in every country is very hard to predict. And that is why the public health experts really need to be on top of the surveillance data to pick up those early signals.
Because in India in February, March and in April we had election rallies, we had religious festivals, there was the Kumbh Mela, and many believe these so-called super spreader events have contributed to the surge. Do you agree with that, that maybe there should have been greater responsibility shown in restricting ourselves from any kind of super spreader events? Because as you said, maybe some data could have shown us that the numbers were slowly beginning to creep up.
We know the situations that the virus likes to spread in, and it loves big gatherings. It loves mass gatherings. It loves people crowding together in indoor spaces. The outdoors is always safer than indoors. But even in outdoors, when thousands of people gather in very close proximity, so there's no physical distancing, if there is no mask wearing, and there are no precautions, taken on people being tested before they gather or after they leave, then the situation is ripe, actually, for transmission of the virus. But in addition to mass gatherings, it's also the increase in social mixing that we saw happening in many countries, but also in India. People celebrating, weddings, people getting together. People, of course, have to go to work. I mean, it's understandable. But I think all of those really added up, and mass gatherings is one of the risk factors that we know about.
So in hindsight, we should have avoided it. Am I correct? In hindsight, of course, it's easier to say that, but you would believe that we should have avoided these large gatherings even in February, March, and when it looked as if the numbers at that time in February were down, we should have still been cautious.
Yes, and I think we need to look ahead. This pandemic is not over, not going to be over for some time. So I think there are lessons to be learned from the last few months in how we manage this pandemic going forward.
I'm again going to come in a moment to the lesson, but I just want to understand, at the moment, do you therefore hold the variants that are emerging responsible for this surge? There's so much of talk of an Indian variant. The UK has termed it a variant of concern. Are there, according to you, a number of Indian variants there? The Maharashtra variant, there's talk of a Telangana, Andhra variant. Do you believe that these variants of concern are responsible for the exponential rise in the Indian context?
Yeah, let me try to explain about the variants. From the beginning, since we've been tracking this pandemic, it started with what is called the Wuhan strain, or the original strain of the virus, and a big global database called GISAID, where now we have over 1.2 million sequences from around the world have been deposited there. So scientists have been able to look at this. This was taken over by the D614 strain sometime in February, March last year. So we knew that certain strains have certain advantages, particularly in the way they're able to transmit. We then saw towards the end of last year, the B117, first described in the UK when they saw this upsurge in southern UK over the period of October to December. But gradually, the B117 variant is now dominant worldwide, including in many parts of India. And the studies done on the B117 clearly show that it is more transmissible, but that it doesn't necessarily lead to very much more severe illness. There's still a debate on that. But the good thing is it's very responsive to the antibodies induced by all the vaccines we have today. Then we had the variant from South Africa, the B1351, and the variant from Brazil. And the variant from Brazil is also very concerning because of some of the mutations that it has clearly increase transmissibility and block antibodies. So these are the three global variants of concern. The B1617, which has been reported from India in increasing numbers, actually, if you look at the proportion of the 617, it is growing and outperforming the other variants in India, is on the list of consideration for the variant of concern. So we have 7 variants of interest. This one is up there, and what we were waiting for is data from the laboratory and from the clinical and epidemiological accompanying studies to see whether it's more transmissible, more clinically severe, or more resistant to antibodies. And it does appear that it will fulfill some of these criteria. We haven't officially called it a variant of concern yet. But what it means, Rajdeep, to put in perspective, I mean, the virus will continue to mutate and adapt. The way that it's transmitted is the same. That hasn't changed. It's just that it finds it easier now because it's able to multiply faster, it's attaching to the receptors faster. So it gives it an advantage to spread. But the public health measures, remain the same. And we need to make sure that we don't give it the environment it needs to spread. So this is why when I said it's multifactorial, yes, it is the variants which are more infectious, but it is also because we've had the social mixing. We've had the opportunity for the virus to transmit from one person to another. So it is always a combination of things which make the variant take off. Same thing happened in other countries as well. It wasn't just that the variant came out of the blue and was able to spread through the population. The population behavior allowed the variant to take off.
But you are seeing the Indian variant, much like the Brazilian variant and the South African variant, as a potential variant of concern. You're making that clear that this is a very transmissible and infectious variant.
Yes, it has some mutations there, which have been seen in other strains, which give it these properties. We're still waiting to see all the final data on, the vaccine effectiveness, and the effectiveness with monoclonal antibodies. There are studies being done in India looking at breakthrough infections from those who had the vaccine and those who've had prior infection, so the reinfections, to see whether the variant is the predominant affecting strain. But even if that is the case, we know that vaccines are not 100% effective. There will be breakthroughs. It only, again, underlines the fact that we need to take the precautions, the mask wearing and the physical distancing and the others for some time to come.
Because we are seeing transmissibility and infection spreading in rural India this time much more than we saw last year. Should that be a major cause for worry? Because you know that the public health infrastructure system in parts of rural India is nowhere else as strong as urban India. Already urban India, the system has struggled to cope up with the rising number of cases. Oxygen supplies have struggled. We've struggled with ICU beds. But if it spreads to rural India, that could be worse. Does that concern you that the geographical spread this time appears far wider?
Yes, it's very concerning. Almost every state in India is showing high test positivity rates, I think except for a couple. And every state in India has shown an increase, as you say, in rural and urban. And the worry in the rural areas is, of course, the capacity of the health system. I think we need to think, urgently now about the approach in rural areas. When you have whole villages that are being impacted by this infection, when people do not have the opportunity for isolation and quarantine the way that maybe people who are living in middle class homes in urban areas have, we need to put in place those mechanisms, those isolation centers where people can be cared for and monitored. The primary healthcare centers do not have access to the molecular diagnostics. So we need a triaging approach, a clinical approach, which will treat everyone with suggestive symptoms as though they have COVID and provide them, the isolation and the care that they need, as well as the quarantine. That's the only way to break community transmission. We can use more rapid antigen tests in rural areas, which do not have the molecular tests. We need to involve the communities, the panchayats, the local self-help groups. They are the ones, if they understand what needs to be done, will be able to organize and do it well. This is the time for communities really to be involved in the decision making and in the implementation of the measures. And as I said, it has to be different in urban and rural.
Well, one other concern that is being voiced also by scientists is the failure of governments to look at data hard enough or actually lie and fudge about data. This is particularly being seen in the context of deaths being reported. The worry is that we are under-reporting deaths or underestimating the number of people who've been affected. Are deaths and cases being underestimated? What is the WHO position on that? Should governments be much more transparent about how much testing are they doing? How much antigen, how much RT-PCR, and more significantly, how many people are actually dying of COVID, Dr. Swaminathan?
There is no doubt, Rajdeep, that both cases and deaths are being undercounted. By what proportion? There are many models and guesses that we can use. It's not really that important. But I think the really key element here is about our data systems, which is linked to our public health system. And I think this pandemic has clearly shown us what we've known for a long time, that our data systems need really to be strengthened. And I think there are many efforts going on actually on doing that, using the digital tools that we have today. But it's not just enough to have that digital backbone or infrastructure. You need the trained people who understand what it is to report the right kind of data, because rubbish in is rubbish out. It's not a question of just entering anything. You need to collect the right data. And I think, again, looking ahead, this is a very grim reminder to India and other countries that investing in public health, investing in primary health care, as opposed to more tertiary hospitals, building that cadre of people, nurses, community health workers, pharmacists, physiotherapists, technicians, and of course doctors who can work at that level and provide the primary care to prevent these huge crowds which now land up at tertiary care hospitals. I'm not saying that people don't need tertiary care. We do need, the All India institutes that are being built. But if we don't simultaneously strengthen our primary healthcare system, no number of big hospitals is going to be able to, because it's a question of not doing the early diagnosis and management, not just for this pandemic, but I'm talking in general. If you do not treat hypertension early enough, you are going to get renal failure that needs dialysis. You are going to get more strokes. You're going to get more heart attacks. So really our whole focus...
Is it in a sense... Is it in a sense, therefore, that you think this pandemic has, in a way, exposed the frailties of what some are now calling a failed state, that we didn't invest enough in public health infrastructure all these years? We've been caught out on oxygen supplies. We've been caught out on ICU beds. Is it a man-made failure to that extent? The pandemic is there, but there's been a man-made failure in our failure to invest enough in public health or be prepared in a way for this second wave.
Yes, and these things don't happen overnight. Some states in India have invested. If you look at Kerala, I think it's been decades of investment in public health that, then bore the fruit. And even that system is being overburdened. So you need a public health cadre. We don't have a public health cadre in most states in India. So it's a matter of investing over the long term. This doesn't happen overnight. And yes, we need to increase investment in health, with the large proportion of that going towards primary health and public health. And as you know, the WHO always, its mantra is universal health coverage. And we are far away from that globally. Right. The number of people with out-of-pocket expenditures increasing. Yesterday, we released a report on the status of midwives globally and found that there's a global shortage of 900 million midwives. So there are different cadres of health providers that need to be developed and trained.
One concern which is not clear at the moment, and maybe you can give clarity from a WHO perspective, is the coronavirus airborne? We get different research papers suggesting that the virus is airborne. Others are a little bit more cautious. The government is now asking people, the Indian government asking people to wear masks at home. Is the debate settled in your view that coronavirus is airborne, therefore you need to wear masks at home and not just outside?
I'll come to that, but I need to correct what I said earlier. I said 900 million, which is a wrong number. The shortage of midwives, I believe, is 900,000. On transmission, yes. We've known since the beginning of last year, from March, April onwards, that this is an airborne infection. Now, what does it mean, airborne? It means that when someone speaks or coughs or sings or laughs, there are always droplets and particles that come out of our mouth, we don't see them. Sometimes you can see them also, the large ones, but most of them you don't see. The larger particles, which are called droplets, they fall to the ground within about 6 feet of distance, just gravity. And that's why that 6 feet rule came about last year, saying that that's a safe distance to maintain. There are, however, smaller particles, microparticles, or you can call them aerosols, which are small enough and light enough to remain in the air for a period of time. Now, that is what is called aerosol transmission. So imagine a small room, or even a larger room, which is completely closed with no ventilation, with a lot of people in that room. And one or two of them are infected. And we've had many, many case descriptions of this kind of events, which prove that, even if you're not in close proximity to someone, you can get infected in that environment because those droplets stay in the air for a period of time, a couple of hours, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours, possibly longer in some instances, in a closed environment where there's no fresh air circulating. So what do we take away from this? The most common mode of transmission is the direct one, where you're in close proximity with someone who has the infection, who may or may not be coughing. You're not wearing a mask, the other person's not wearing a mask, and you're together for a significant period, 15 to 20 minutes, let's say you're talking to each other. Yes, there is a high chance that you could get the infection. If both are wearing masks, that risk comes down significantly by 60 or 70%. If you're in a home, let's say, with your own family members and everybody is well, I don't believe that there is a need to wear a mask. However, if you're having friends over and you're gathering with people who normally don't live in the same home, yes, it's better that everybody wear a mask because we don't know if somebody's got the asymptomatic infection at that stage. And certainly when you are going to be in a situation where there are more people, when you're stepping out, going to the shops or any other place where you cannot maintain the distancing, it is good to wear a mask. And, in the US, for some period of time, they were even recommending double masks with a surgical mask underneath and then a cloth mask on top. It's really important that high quality mask be worn, not just a piece of cloth or a handkerchief that's sort of loosely hanging on your face. So the most important thing is good quality with a well-fitting mask, covering the nose and mouth, maybe a double mask if you're really in a crowded environment to have extra protection.
I think you've given us clarity on masks, clarity on one more issue, Dr. Swaminathan, which is vaccinations. The WHO has been saying vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. What are we finding in India? Actually, vaccinations have come down in the last month. There's a shortage of vaccines. What is your, what is that the way out now that we just have to vaccinate much more in the next few months? And how do you see the Indian challenge given the size of our population? Because at present rate, it could take anything from 2 to even by some estimates, 10 years to give everyone a double dose across 100 billion people. So 100 billion people. So how do you see, what do you see the role of vaccinations? What will WHO do to help India speeden up this vaccination process? Is that our big failure?
No, it's a global problem, and we've been crying ourselves hoarse about vaccine equity around the world. There are countries which are much worse off than India, Rajdeep. I think we have huge advantages in that we have these manufacturers that have been over the years supplying the world with vaccines and are rising to the occasion now. So I think we are in a and we should be proud of what we have in India in terms of the vaccine manufacturing capacity. The situation obviously today is that you cannot have enough supplies for the demand. It is taking time for manufacturers to ramp up and scale up their production enough. And remember, vaccines are being given to people who are healthy. So we need to make sure that the safety and the quality and the manufacturing quality are maintained. We cannot rush into vaccine production that might actually result in some things that we don't want. So they need the time and investment. Many countries put lots of money into. India has also now invested in expanding manufacturing of a couple of. So over time, we'll see the supplies going up. Today, we have a situation where demand outstrips supplies. As I said, globally, there are African countries which have not even vaccinated their frontline workers and health workers. At least in India, I believe over 80-90% of our healthcare workers are vaccinated, and about 45%, I think, of our over 60-year-olds. But overall, population-wise, yes, only 2% have received 2 doses, 10% 1 dose, and we know that's not fully protective, could be partially protected. It is going to take time. I mean, there is no shortcut. The vaccines have to be manufactured, then they have to be distributed, and then they have to go into people's arms. And it takes a couple of months for people to get the 2 doses and to get the immunity. So, yes, vaccines are, the long-term, I think, solution out of this pandemic, but not for several months, or maybe even we can talk about years. And that's why we need to prepare for all the other things we need to do in the meantime as we scale up vaccination.
But does it worry you that there are people in India, even after taking the double dose vaccine, who are becoming corona positive. Should that be a cause of concern? How effective are the vaccines still remains a big question mark, given these new variants.
I wouldn't worry about that too much, Rajdeep. The data that's emerging from countries which have scaled vaccines are showing that they have a huge protective effect, particularly on severe disease and hospitalization. Breakthrough infections, yes, it's expected. No vaccine is 100% effective. It ranges between 70 to 95%. The current vaccines that we have. So it's expected that there will be breakthroughs, and we have to track now to see whether the variants are actually causing more of the breakthrough infections. But even if that is the case, the vaccines which are currently approved will protect the majority of people against getting severely ill. You may still get the infection, but it will prevent you from landing in that ICU.
But as you said, the vaccination process could take time. Till then, is lockdown the only solution the moment cases rise? Tamil Nadu has declared lockdowns. We've got Karnataka lockdowns. Different parts of India are declaring lockdowns. Has the time come, you think, as Dr. Fauci has suggested to an Indian newspaper, that India needs a 2-week lockdown, India needs a 1-month lockdown? Are the various suggestions being mooted? Do you agree with that? Time has come for a national lockdown, not just localized lockdowns?
It's a very difficult question, and I can see why it's hard, for policymakers, because on the one hand, India is such a huge and heterogeneous country. And looking at the data, I know that there are about 240 or 50 odd districts which currently have a test positivity rate of over 10%. Many districts still have a test positivity rate of less than 5%, provided they're doing enough testing. So while a national lockdown could give some time, in the sense that it would break these chains of transmission by stopping people from really moving around anywhere, giving some breathing time for the health system to prepare itself again. So what they called a circuit breaker in the UK last year, where they went into a complete shutdown for a couple of weeks. But at the same time, we need to make sure the lessons from last year's lockdown are learned, that the most vulnerable and the people who are going to lose their livelihoods are taken care of, that there's social support structures put in place, as well as ensuring that people who are ill and need medical care can be. So there are a number of things which will need to be put in place if a full lockdown is to be implemented.
So are you suggesting we are at 4 lakh cases per day, 4,000 deaths per day? Are we not in a situation where we need a national lockdown? Is it not inevitable?
Again, as I said, many states have done it. And in fact, if you look at the data, the states that have implemented stringent measures, you can actually see the test positivity rate and the RT or the R naught coming down. So it does work. Putting in place restrictions does work. So whether it's done, state by state or at the national level, I think that's something that probably needs to be discussed, amongst the leaders, and then a decision taken. But really, it helps. It does help to cut transmission.
So a final question: the third wave. There's already talk of a third wave. Is it inevitable there will be a third wave with more variants, more mutation? Or do you believe it is premature to talk of the world facing a third wave, or India facing a third wave in July, August, as is being suggested?
Again, with the behavior of this virus, we know that it takes off when the conditions are right. It reaches a peak. Usually these public health measures are stringent measures, are put in place to reduce the spread. It comes down. Last year, we brought it down to very low levels. It was almost at an endemic sort of a level at 15, 20,000 cases a day. And then gradually it took off. So yes, this can happen again. We don't know how many waves there will be in the future. There are many countries that have experienced third waves when they let their guard down. So I think the important thing is that to handle the second wave now, to do what is necessary to save lives, is the most important thing. But then really need to prepare the systems for future third waves. And I think you may not be able to prevent it entirely, but you can certainly minimize the impact of any future wave by acting early.
But that also presumably means making sure that your oxygen plants are in place, making sure your ICU beds are in place, preparing the infrastructure. You're saying one of the lessons in a way from the first to the second wave to avoid or to minimize deaths in the third wave is just prepare better. Am I correct?
Yes, exactly. Learn the lessons from over the last couple of months and prepare better.
Because one of the concerns of a third wave is that it could affect children. We've just heard some doctors suggesting they're worried that children could be affected. Is the WHO worried that this pandemic, which at one time was seen to affect senior citizens, could affect children in the future?
I'm not aware of any data that suggests that any, possible future waves are going to affect children in particular. But one thing is true, that as countries start vaccinating their older people, you can see that older people are being protected and that there are less of infection, less of hospitalization in that age group. And so the age groups that are getting affected is coming down. You see that in Israel, UK, etc., where the elderly really have been completely protected now. So that way you could say relatively that younger people could get infected. Children, we've seen from the beginning that while they can get infected, especially children under 10 are usually asymptomatic, usually not picked up and don't get sick. And it's very rare serious events that we see in children who are infected. The multi-organ inflammatory syndrome, it's a very rare complication. So I think because of the protection that vaccines will give to older, you could see it in younger people. Also, as schools, colleges open, as younger people start moving around, that again adds to the transmission. But I think we really need to think about a strategy for our children, because already they've been out of school for a year. This year continues to look bleak in terms of education. And that is a really worrying situation, particularly for the millions of children who do not have access to online education. So I think there needs to be serious thinking about how we're going to help those children bridge this gap that they've had. And I think vaccinating school teachers and getting schools functioning again, especially government schools, putting in place the precautions that we need is going to be something that we need to think about.
Ma'am, in conclusion, and I've asked you this whenever I've interviewed you, is do you think that things will get better 2-3 months down the line? Do you see the opening up of a country like India in the next couple of months, or do you believe we just now cannot predict what the future holds, and therefore 2021 is also looking rather bleak?
No, Rajdeep, I am optimistic that we will get out of this wave, which is really, I think, sort of demoralized public, and it's been extremely heartbreaking and painful, to see the suffering that's been experienced. But as I said, I think if we can at least learn from all of this that has happened to make sure that our systems are strengthened. It's not, of course, there are no magic fixes for the system. It needs thoughtful and sustained investment. But health today, we've seen, it's brought painfully back to us the fact that if you don't invest in health, then nothing else really matters. So I hope that in the future that India will become a shining example, with Ayushman Bharat, with the plans that we have for a country which never again has to suffer something like this.
You're saying all this at a time where, as you know, the Indian government is coming under a lot of criticism for its handling of the second wave. Do you believe that criticism is justified or not?
I believe that self-reflection is important, and in fact the WHO recommends what we call the after-action reviews. You can do an intra-action review to see how you're doing in the middle of things, but if that's not possible, an after-action review is very, very important to learn what went right and what didn't go right. And also, you mentioned right at the beginning the cases and the deaths. I think there are methodologies to estimate deaths. And in India, 20% only of deaths have a cause of death reporting. So again, it's a system that we need to strengthen for the future, not just for this pandemic. It's important to understand the burden of disease in the population. And one way of doing that is by strengthening the cause of death reporting. So there are many elements of our system and infrastructure that need to be, and we need to be united, I think, at this time and really work together to achieve this, because it's important for all Indians.
Dr. Swaminathan, you've spoken as always with a lot of wisdom and clarity. I appreciate your joining us. Clearly, India faces major challenges, and sadly, one must report that we have been a failed state when it comes to public health. But this is the ultimate wake-up call that we've received, and hopefully, fir subah hogi, tomorrow will be better. Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you.